a quiet controversy brews. The kind that, despite originating in daytime television, echoes far beyond its set walls. This isn't just a celebrity faux pas or a gaffe destined for memes. This is about a comment so incendiary, so disjointed from reality, that it sparked unified outrage, not only from the usual critics, but from voices within the very ideological sphere it was meant to appease. It began with a statement from Whoopi Goldberg on The View, a show that holds an almost cult-like affection among many liberal viewers. Goldberg, with all her gravitas and a long history in media, sat before her co-hosts and uttered a sentence that many considered not just tone-deaf, but deeply offensive, that it was worse being Black in America than it was to live in Iran. The comment didn't linger long in obscurity. Within hours, social media erupted. The words cut across political divides, not just criticized by conservatives, but drawing sharp condemnation from progressives, commentators, and even Hollywood elites. To many, it was an astounding display of ignorance. Iran, where theocratic rule limits nearly every aspect of personal freedom, especially for women and LGBTQ+ individuals. A country where a woman can be arrested or worse for removing her hijab, for traveling without a man's permission, for expressing her identity. Where being gay isn't just socially taboo, but punishable by death. In contrast, Goldberg's framing of the U.S., despite its historical and present injustices, as more oppressive, struck many as absurd. Bill Maher didn't hold back. On Real Time, he took direct aim at Goldberg's comments and the broader culture of The View. To Maher, Goldberg's statements weren't just misinformed, they were actively dangerous, serving as a caricature of the left's most irrational voices. He called for a reckoning, urging Democrats to stop giving shows like The View a free pass simply because they align politically. Do something about her, he said bluntly. And his frustration was not just with the individual, but with what she represented. A refusal to acknowledge reality for the sake of ideological purity. The backlash crescendoed when Representative Wesley Hunt, a Black Congressman from Texas, weighed in with quiet, pointed clarity. In a segment that rapidly gained traction, Hunt offered a living contradiction to Goldberg's claims. Born a direct descendant of slaves, Hunt represents a majority white district in a deep red state. He reminded viewers that while the past of America is stained with undeniable injustices, the progress made is real and meaningful. His great-great-grandfather was born into slavery. He is now a United States congressman, and he was elected by people who, statistically, likely voted for Donald Trump. I'm judged not by the color of my skin, but the content of my character, Hunt said. A nod to the idealism of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., made tangible in his own journey. For Hunt, Goldberg's comments weren't just inaccurate, they were a betrayal of progress. He pointed out that his father grew up under Jim Crow laws and yet raised a congressman. That trajectory to him symbolized the real story of Black America. It's not that racism doesn't exist, but that it no longer defines the totality of one's possibilities. By comparing that progress to the rigid, authoritarian oppression of a regime like Iran's, Goldberg didn't just miss the mark. She dismissed the triumphs of generations. Critics on both sides of the aisle began to draw a line, not only calling out the comment, but the culture that enabled it. Shows like The View, many argued, had become echo chambers where radicalism isn't just tolerated, it's rewarded. The culture of outrage, of identity politics over nuanced thought, has turned what was once a morning panel into a lightning rod of division. The irony was thick. As Goldberg positioned herself as a voice for the oppressed, she ignored the literal oppression of millions abroad, insisting instead that America, imperfect, flawed, but open to change, was the darker place. And in doing so, she inadvertently became a symbol of the very elitism and detachment that critics claim has overtaken liberal discourse. It wasn't just a bad take, it was a rejection of lived truth, both hers and others. The backlash didn't end with Maher or Hunt. Viewers began to question why such statements are allowed to go unchecked, why shows that claim to empower continue to allow narratives that distort, ignore, or mislead. Even those who once defended Goldberg began to recoil, unwilling to tether their own values to a platform seemingly disinterested in reflection or accountability. Yet amidst the controversy, a deeper conversation began to take shape. One not merely about Goldberg or The View, but about the state of discourse itself. happens when ideological performance outweighs intellectual integrity? When allegiance to narrative blinds people to truth? And perhaps most troublingly, when those with the loudest voices lose their grasp on the very issues they claim to champion. As the outrage simmered into sustained public discourse, the ramifications of Whoopi Goldberg's remark became more layered than a simple celebrity misstep. This wasn't just an error in judgment, it had become a flashpoint, forcing a confrontation between cultural narratives and grounded reality. For many, Goldberg's refusal to acknowledge the brutal, authoritarian practices of Iran represented more than just a gaffe. It exemplified the disconnect between performative advocacy and lived suffering. Critics noted the selective morality that seems to pervade conversations within platforms like The View. When atrocities committed under hardline regimes like Iran's are downplayed or ignored in favor of hyperbolic domestic comparisons, it cheapens the meaning of actual oppression. Iran isn't just restrictive, it's repressive. Women there face mandatory dress codes under threat of violence. LGBTQ+ individuals risk prison or execution for simply existing. Dissent is criminalized. And yet, these realities were brushed aside in Goldberg's attempt to paint America as uniquely and disproportionately unjust. That oversight didn't just spark backlash, it ignited a deeper cynicism among even sympathetic viewers. In his takedown, Maher insisted that such recklessness must have consequences, not because Goldberg's views were unpopular, but because they were untethered from fact. The left, he argued, needs a course correction, not a drift further into ideological absurdity, but a return to evidence-based reasoning. And while some viewers tried to rationalize Goldberg's sentiment as merely hyperbolic commentary meant to provoke discussion, others saw it as indicative of a broader intellectual laziness, a tendency to score outrage points rather than wrestle with difficult truths. Nowhere was this disconnect more poignantly challenged than by Wesley Hunt. His calm, sincere rebuttal didn't rely on snark or insults. He spoke from lineage and lived experience. A descendant of slaves now sitting in Congress, elected by a white majority conservative district in Texas, a fact that speaks to American transformation. He described how his father's life under Jim Crow laws evolved into a reality where his own son could serve in the highest levels of government. That journey, Hunt made clear, doesn't negate racism. It celebrates resilience and the structures that allowed for change. And in doing so, he delivered a lesson more impactful than any viral monologue. Progress is real, and denying it erodes its significance. It wasn't just Hunt or Maher raising the alarm. Commentary across digital and traditional media grew louder. Detractors from within liberal spheres began to echo a concern long voiced by conservatives, that the refusal to engage with complexity, to accept that America can be both flawed and free, is destroying credibility. The incident became a case study in how self-righteous rhetoric can undermine legitimate causes. A country where voices like Hunt's are elected is not a country equal to Iran, period. The implications extended beyond the realm of television or politics. Cities like New York and Chicago, once global cultural hubs, have become examples of what many see as failed progressive leadership. Rising crime, economic disparity, urban decay. Commentators pointed to these cities not as symbols of liberal potential, but as cautionary tales of what happens when idealism is not balanced by practicality. For them, Goldberg's statement didn't exist in isolation. It was the product of a worldview that overlooks real-world suffering in favor of ideological purity. As the controversy rolled forward, others pointed out the broader trend, a media class increasingly perceived as detached from the people it claims to represent. Goldberg's statement was, in that context, not shocking, but expected. The View has long been accused of manufacturing drama and peddling hot takes over critical thought. And while it thrives on its controversial edge, the real cost, some argue, is intellectual and cultural trust. When advocacy becomes indistinguishable from ignorance, movements lose coherence, and audiences respect. Goldberg's refusal to meaningfully engage with the severity of Iran's policies, especially toward women and LGBTQ+ people, was seen by many as a betrayal of the very rights she claims to defend. She brushed aside honor killings, public executions, and mass censorship. She scoffed at documented abuses of human dignity. In doing so, she exposed a troubling contradiction. the impulse to denounce America's sins while excusing those of regimes far more brutal. This selective outrage didn't merely enrage, it alienated. The question quickly became, how did we get here? When did the goal shift from truth to tribalism? And what does it say about modern discourse when someone as prominent as Goldberg can assert something so profoundly misinformed without immediate internal correction from her co-hosts or the network? Is it fear of backlash? Apathy? Or has ideology become such a dominant lens that facts are now viewed as inconvenient distractions? Amid all this, Goldberg's defenders attempted to pivot. Some insisted her comments were being taken out of context. Others accused critics of weaponizing outrage. But no matter how they spun it, the facts remained, and the footage was damning. Even more unsettling was her insistence on not addressing the specific conditions in Iran when challenged. Her response was to shut down the conversation entirely. "Let's not do that," she said when Iran's human rights abuses were mentioned. It was a chilling phrase, a verbal hand wave to the real suffering of millions. The story, at its core, became one not about Whoopi Goldberg, but about the cost of willful ignorance. About what happens when influence is paired with misinformation, and when empathy is offered selectively rather than universally. This wasn't a partisan issue, it was a human one. And it forced many to reevaluate the voices they trust, the platforms they support, and the narratives they consume. In the end, this controversy wasn't about left or right. It was about truth and the courage to speak it. Whether or not Goldberg ever issues a genuine acknowledgement of her mistake, the broader reckoning has already begun. Audiences are no longer passive. They are watching closely. And they are no longer afraid to ask the question, if someone so powerful can ignore reality so brazenly, what else are they willing to distort?